Behind me stands the Virginia Memorial, and atop of this memorial, this monument on the Gettysburg battlefield, 40 feet in the air, looking over the fields of Pickett's charge, stands Robert E. Lee. Perhaps no other man was as feared and respected in American history than Marse Robert. Today on Forward Gettysburg, we're going to be discussing Lee, the American Napoleon.
Hey everybody, this is Matt Atkinson, and you're watching Forward Gettysburg with Aaron Smith.
How's it going, everybody? Aaron Smith here for Forward Gettysburg. Thank you guys so much for joining me. If you are liking the channel, if you are liking the videos, if you are into the Civil War and Gettysburg campaign content, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. You guys have a real treat in store for you today. I have been tossing around this idea for quite a bit now and finally decided to pull the trigger on it. So here we go. Lee, the American Napoleon. So by the summer of 1863, Robert E. Lee had cemented his legacy as one of the most feared and respected military commanders of the Confederacy. No other man had wreaked havoc upon the Union forces like Robert E. Lee. By the summer of 63, it has been nothing but victory after victory after victory, with a small little speed bump there at Antietam. You could call that a Union victory. I think it's more of a draw, but outside of Antietam, Robert E. Lee has been crushing it for the Confederacy in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. Lee had gained a reputation as a bold and audacious general, and it's not too far of a stretch to compare him to Napoleon, another another bold and audacious general. Now, there's no doubt that Robert E. Lee was influenced, like many 19th century students of military history and students at West Point, there's no doubt that he was influenced by Napoleon. In fact, records show 5 of the 6 first books that Robert E. Lee checked out of the West Point Library were about Napoleon, and they were written in French, and Robert E. Lee actually knew French. He was able to read these books in their native language. So as West Point is growing and becoming a very respected academy, there's no doubt that Napoleon's influence spread to the cadets and spread to the curriculum at West Point. And Robert E. Lee is going to take the campaigns, the strategies of Napoleon, and cultivate them in with his own experiences to become the greatest military mind ever seen in the Western Hemisphere. So first, let's take a look at what Napoleon says about the general commanding, the mastermind, the leadership, the leader of the army. What qualities does Napoleon point out that makes a successful general commanding? Napoleon states, "The most essential quality for a general is firmness of character." Lee was raised in a very aristocratic Virginia. Virginia, you know, when you think of these grand plantations and these very polite people, you know, this idea of character, of honor, of valor, you know, these are very important ideas that they valued back in that time, back in that area of Virginia. So Robert E. Lee is going to grow up in this, where where the quality of character is valued very highly, and Robert E. Lee is going to internalize that. In fact, Lee was often recognized for his high character. He was often recognized for being a gentleman and being this very, very trustworthy, this honest, this very forward a type of person. So it's no doubt that Robert E. Lee is recognized for his character and has strong character, one of the elements that make a strong leader. Napoleon also stresses the importance of a general meeting the needs of his men. And it's no doubt that Robert E. Lee is able to fulfill that role. In fact, one of the reasons Lee is up here in Pennsylvania is he's trying to procure supplies. He's trying to find food, shoes, all kinds of supplies for his army, because he realizes that the men have nothing, that area of Virginia they've been campaigning in for up to Gettysburg in July of 1863, that area of Virginia is barren. Two massive armies have been marching in that area, have been campaigning in that area. So Lee realizes his men truly need food. His men truly need supplies. So he is going to bring his campaign, his summer campaign, north of the Mason-Dixon line. Not only that, but I feel Lee recognizes that his men, their families. Now remember, a lot of these Confederates, most of them worked on farms. Most of them were farmers. So they recognize that their family farms are also feeling the squeeze of the war. They're sending off, God forbid, they're in Virginia where these armies have been campaigning. There's probably no farm anymore. They've been wiped clean. So he realizes that he needs to take the burden off of southern farms. He needs to bring the war north. And so Robert E. Lee is really, really keen to the needs and necessities of his men, not just the physical needs, but the emotional and familial needs as well. Napoleon also recognizes the importance of a leader bringing high morale to those under his command. And by July of 1863, Robert E. Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, their morale is at a fever pitch. Their morale is the highest it has ever been and ever will be in the Civil War. The men have had success after success after success, and they truly, truly think themselves invincible. They really truly believe that they cannot be beaten. And up to that point, since being under the command of Robert E. Lee 18 months earlier, they have every reason to believe that. They have secured Confederate victory after Confederate victory after Confederate victory. So the morale of the Army of Northern Virginia is incredibly high. And even though they are low on supplies, even though many of them do not have shoes, that doesn't matter to them because they are marching with Robert E. Lee. They are under the command of Marse Robert, and they are going to whip the Yankees in their own territory. Napoleon, in fact, attributed the success of his own men to a love of country, a spirit of enthusiasm, and a sense of national honor. When we take those three things and apply them to the Army of Northern Virginia, we can see just why they were so successful. Now, on the field of battle, Lee's Napoleonic influence shines even brighter. Napoleon often warned his generals to avoid councils of war. And we know that on the federal side, George Meade calls several councils of war, most famously the night of July 2nd, where about 12 of his highest ranking generals crammed into the Lydia Leicester house there just over this ridge and decided what to do the next day. Robert E. Lee never really called councils of war. He would confer with his generals, but it was never truly called a council of war. He never really met with more than 2 generals at a time. So Robert E. Lee avoided the councils of war, just like Napoleon. Napoleon states, "Great captains know how to master chance." And there was no greater master of chance than Robert E. Lee. And we need look no further than the Chancellorsville campaign. Robert E. Lee was outnumbered nearly 2-1 by Joseph Hooker and the Army of the Potomac. Robert E. Lee disobeyed one of the great maxims of military strategy: never divide your force in the face of superior numbers. Robert E. Lee disobeyed that maxim not once, not twice, but 3 times during the Chancellorsville campaign. However, these were calculated risks. Robert E. Lee didn't just do this willy-nilly. Robert E. Lee was very, very calculating. He knew the chances. He knew the risks involved in taking this chance and went ahead with them anyway and came off with his perfect victory. One of the greatest victories, not only in American military history, but in world military history. Napoleon had a knack for finding the decisive point on the battlefield. I'm going to ask your forgiveness before I butcher this French, because I never really studied French. But the decisive point, le point décisif. I don't know, that might sound pretty good. Le point décisif of the battlefield, the decisive point. And Robert E. Lee, from the beginning of day 2, recognized the decisive point of the Gettysburg battlefield. He recognized that Cemetery Hill was the key to the position. In fact, on July 1st, he realized it when he ordered Ewell to take that hill if practicable. But Robert E. Lee, all of his subsequent offensive actions at Gettysburg had one goal in mind: to take Cemetery Hill. Robert E. Lee, just like Napoleon, recognized the decisive point, le point décisif of the battlefield. And his entire plan here at Gettysburg revolves around taking, capturing, making it untenable Cemetery Hill. Napoleon recognized that the core of victory was to maneuver in such a way as to engage the mass of the forces with fractions only of the hostile force. And this was never more evident for Robert E. Lee than on July 3rd, 1863, in these fields behind me. Now, July 2nd, we know Robert E. Lee attacked the flanks of the Union Army. There was the incredibly bloody and costly fighting on the left flank: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, South Cemetery Ridge. All of those attacks went off on the left flank. We have the right flank, Culp's Hill, Spangler's Spring, those areas there. Robert E. Lee thought, I attacked their flanks. The center must be weak. And he thought that for good reason. He saw himself, the Union, scrambling to reinforce the left flank, to make that a stronger position, because the Union realized that the Confederates were trying to roll up that flank and get up to Cemetery Hill. So come July 3rd, Lee is going to plan an assault with Pickett's division in the lead and other elements of his 2 other corps to assault the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Robert E. Lee is going to mass 13,000 to 15,000 men to strike that ridge. Of course, we all know how the history plays out, but Robert E. Lee is following that Napoleonic maxim to mass his forces against the key point on the battlefield, to mass his forces against what Lee thought was a fraction of the enemy forces. No discussion about Napoleon could ever be complete without discussing the artillery. Napoleon started as an artillerist, and Napoleon, from day one, recognized the importance of the cannon. He recognized the importance of the artillery on the battlefield. He even states, "Great battles are won with artillery. Fire is everything." And Robert E. Lee perhaps had his greatest mastery of artillery here at Gettysburg. We have the massive artillery bombardment on July 2nd along Seminary Ridge, Warfield Ridge, nearly 100 guns bombarding the left flank of the Union line. And the even greater bombardment on July 3rd, nearly 150 guns in an enfilading position, a surrounding fire, a crossfire, a swarming fire upon Cemetery Ridge. 150 guns, the largest artillery bombardment in the Western Hemisphere. Robert E. Lee wanted to soften them up, and he recognized the importance of the artillery in doing that job. He will unleash and again, pardon my French, he will unleash a feu d'enfer, a hellfire, unlike anything ever seen on the American continent to that point. One of the clearest Napoleonic influences upon Robert E. Lee is the idea of a relentless assault. Napoleon says, once you have undertaken the offensive, it should be maintained to the last extremity. Lee did this exact thing at Gettysburg. On July 1st, Robert E. Lee took the offensive, put the Union Army on the defense. On July 2nd and subsequently July 3rd, Robert E. Lee did the same thing. After his success on July 1st, he thought he was gaining the momentum minute by minute, hour by hour. And for good reason. His men had sent the Yankees packing back through the streets of Gettysburg. They had won an astounding victory on July 1st, an overwhelming victory. So on July 2nd and July 3rd, Robert E. Lee is going to continue that momentum. Robert E. Lee was never one who needed the invitation to take the initiative. We can look again at Chancellorsville. The first day of Chancellorsville, Hooker, at the very beginning, was actually winning that battle. But he was very cautious and withdrew his men back and gave up that initiative. So Lee seized that initiative and drove the Union Army back to the Chancellor House, and in the subsequent days after, secured one of his greatest victories ever in the American Civil War. And here at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee will continue to press assault after assault after assault, thinking that his invincible men, his Army of Northern Virginia, was close to securing victory. Now, the Lee-Napoleon analogy is not a perfect analogy. Robert E. Lee was considerably older than Napoleon during the time of his emperorship. Robert E. Lee was well into his 50s by the time of Gettysburg, whereas Napoleon was in his 30s. And perhaps more obvious, Napoleon, as emperor, was very involved in the political realm of France at the time. Robert E. Lee never really got involved in politics. The argument could be made that, like how Napoleon terrorized and struck fear and commanded the respect on the battlefield of other European nations, Robert E. Lee did the same exact thing on the American continent against the armies of the North. I truly feel Robert E. Lee was the greatest military mind in all of American history. When we think of military geniuses, we think of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon, and Robert E. Lee. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Forward Gettysburg. I hope you enjoyed it. This is something different that I wanted to do. This has been an analogy that I've been working up in my mind for quite some time now. And then I actually found an article on the National Park Service archives that broke it down actually really well. So if you guys are able to just do a quick Google Lee Napoleon NPS, you should be able to find that article. It was really great. But thank you all so much for joining me. As always, I'm your host, Aaron Smith. This is Forward Gettysburg, and I will catch you on the next one.
I wish I was in the land of cotton,